Good afternoon, brothers and sisters.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. We indeed owe Dr. Emily Towns a debt, and she has brought us together in order to talk and share and converse in a way that quite hasn't happened before. And so this very special woman, our new president of the AAR, her colleagues here at Yale and at the larger Yale University, we are all very thankful to you, Emily, for bringing us together. I'd like to introduce our panel to you for this afternoon. On my immediate left is Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who is the Annie Scales Rogers Professor of Christian Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Presbyterian School of Christian Education in Richmond, Virginia. Next to Dr. Cannon is Dr. Linda E. Thomas, Professor of Theology and Anthropology at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. And to Dr. Thomas's left, Professor Kathleen Neal Cleaver, Senior Research Scholar in Law, Senior Lecturer in African American Studies here at Yale University. These women are going to start an incredible conversation today, and we will begin in just a second, but let me tell you who I am. I'm Joan Martin. I'm Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge. Our question for this afternoon is this: what do we gain and what do we lose in the shift from commemorating Martin Luther King's assassination to celebrating the anniversary of his birth, as we will this year, 40 years after his death? Professor Cleaver is going to lead us off.
Well, I have to tell you, I didn't know that until this minute that I was going to start. But be that as it may, I'm actually somewhat perturbed anyway about the way the King birthday celebration has evolved, because the King that's proposed during those birthday celebrations is basically unrecognizable. Because I was around when King was there, I saw things he did, I was involved in movements that in some senses were antagonistic, but in some senses were complementary. I was in SNCC, I met King at his home, I was in the Black Panther Party. I was very, very conscious of how King's very sudden death thrust the Black Power, and particularly the Black Panther movement, into a whole different plane immediately. But when we hear the celebrations of his birthday, it's almost too repetitive. We hear about the I have a dream, which is, I say, you know, in history, in Black history, certain individuals get taglines. Ain't I a woman? I'm sick and tired of being sick. Well, the King's tagline has become, I have a dream. And the problem with this is that's a 1963 statement. We don't ever get into what King had to say about the Vietnam War. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church. We never get into that on his birthday. So, before the birthday became a holiday, and before it, and I'm not actually critical of it being a holiday, I'm critical of the platitudinous sort of chocolate saint that is presented on the birthday.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You got Dr. Joe.
Okay. Okay. So, but when you get into the assassination, as I was actually somewhat surprised last night to see the analysis that this attorney William Pepper, who has presented in several books, Orders to Kill and Act of State, and he had recently revised Act of State. Pepper claims that he has solved the assassination. And he has an analysis and an understanding. He's found somebody that he thinks is Raoul. He knows who he thinks was behind the shooting. combination of Dixie Mafia and U.S. military intelligence. But what they did with his work, I was actually surprised to see on CNN that they actually interviewed Pepper. They actually showed part of the assassination committee hearings. But what they did is show it to show that it wasn't true. I mean, my point is, when you focus on King, the day of King's assassination, and we look at what we lost, we also have to look at how did we lose it? How did we lose King? How was it that this man, who in 1964 had a Nobel Peace Prize, in 1968 is assassinated? Today I came across something, he didn't say it today, he said it in Memphis, but I think it's very timely. I'm just going to quote from his sermon at the Mason Temple in Memphis. I'm just going to quote, you know, just like the news media, I'm going to take one line out of context. So he was talking about the story of the Dives, is this Dives? Dives, who went to hell because he kept passing by Lazarus and refused to see his plight. And then King told them, well, if America does not use her vast resource of wealth to end poverty and to make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too is going to hell. Right?
That's clear.
Now that's Martin Luther King, and that's 1968. They didn't have videotape and YouTube, so it's not getting looped all the time, you know. But in the context of 1968, what King was focused on was the Poor People's March, the campaign to unify poor people, whether they were Indians, whether they were black, whether they were Chicanos, whether they were white, unify the poor people and have a caravan going to Washington, D.C. Now, there was a clip I saw on one show that showed King in a church in Mississippi where he was trying to organize people to participate in this caravan. And you have to understand, the SCLC folk weren't actually all that thrilled about this caravan. They definitely weren't even thrilled about King going to Memphis to work with the strikers. So King was moving in a way that was challenging structures of power, similar to the way we who called ourselves, he called us the young militants who are in the revolutionary spirit. Well, King was moving into the revolutionary spirit. And so that's what he was around. So if you look at his assassination, we focus on the assassination, we look at King at that time, you get a very different picture of the King than in 1963. But you also, in my opinion, have to look at the use of assassination as a political weapon in the United States in the 60s. And so what I want to throw out, and where I want you to go with this, is we have to look at who was murdered in 1963. In June, it was Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi. In November, it was John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, in Dallas, Texas. That's in 1963, just as the Vietnam War is unfurling. It's even before the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It's before the actual official military, but we're in it. That's 1963. That radically changes what's going to happen in terms of Vietnam and many domestic things. 1965, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X, had left the Nation of Islam, had become an Orthodox Muslim, was organizing the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and was giving a speech in Harlem, and he was assassinated in February of 1965. Now, Kennedy was shot in broad daylight. Malcolm X was shot in broad daylight. Medgar Evers was shot, I think, in the evening, but in his driveway. Martin Luther King, as we know, was shot in broad daylight on his way to dinner, 1968 in April. And 1968 in June, Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel just after winning the California primary. So I think what we are looking at is a form of political terrorism, because people in this country were being terrified or agitated or angered, or at least what we see is the ability of powerful military and violent organizations or men to shift the political direction. Because what was it? What was it that, oh, and then the culminating one that you have to acknowledge is in 1969 in December, in his sleep, in a safe house in Chicago where he was hiding, Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Black Panther Party, was murdered, shot in the head while he slept. Now, many things could be said about Fred Hampton, but the one thing I want to bring out is that he had been actively engaged in building something called the Rainbow Coalition. The Rainbow Coalition involved blacks, Black Panthers, whites in the Young Patriot organization, and Puerto Ricans in the Young Lords, and later brought in the others. But what I wanted to get at, this was the multiracial solidarity against racism and against violence. For King's Poor People's March, it was a multiracial solidarity against poverty, and of course, along with poverty comes violence. So what I think is that those sets of assassinations, we can look at the King assassination by itself, but we can also look at the use of political assassination, those people who were targets. We can't say that the President of the United States was the target of COINTELPRO. We really can't say that. Not like Fred Hampton, not like Malcolm X, or Martin Luther King. But what we can say is that removing these leaders, and it's not because they were leaders, it's because of the ideas that they gave and inspired and encouraged among millions of people. That those killings paved the way for a highly reactionary law and order, white supremacist politics, which has now come to the level of an onslaught. And they wanted to eliminate, well, they did succeed in many ways, the gains of the civil rights and the social justice movements that would have, had not this politics of assassination been in place, would have put us in a very, very different position vis-a-vis poverty, economic justice, human rights, and hopefully world peace.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I, too, would like to join Dr. Martin in saying thank you to Dr. Towns. We especially appreciate being able to have this conversation at this historical moment. And I always like to begin any conversation I have with saying a little bit about my philosophical roots. I've been identified by where I work, but I come to this conversation this afternoon as a womanist scholar and anthropologist, which means I love who I am as a black woman and would like to put the category of gender into the conversation very squarely. I also want to say that I am a member of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago.
All right.
And to partially quote my friend Michelle Obama, this is the first time in my adult life that I have found a spiritual community that embodies the full tenets of Black and womanist theology in liberation. This church, for the last 36 years under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, Jr., used a ticket that has been referred to in the previous session, used a ticket that was paid for by our Black predecessors to boldly proclaim our Black humanity, our Black spirit, our Black culture. But we have been put into the international limelight because one Black man had the audacity to hope that he could become the president of this country. I arrived at this conference last night at 11:30 p.m. instead of 11:30 a.m. as I was scheduled to originally, because my new pastor, the Reverend Otis Moss III, who is a graduate of this institution, asked me and others to join him in a press conference held at our church. It was held, of course, on the eve of the commemoration of Dr. King's death for a reason, because Dr. Moss, along with two other people, the president of the UCC church, a Mr. Thomas, and the president of the National Council of Churches, stood together with Reverend Moss, basically saying that when you bother this church, you bother all the churches. But more specifically, Reverend Moss said that when you mess with this church, you are messing with the prophetic tradition of the African American church and the prophetic tradition. And so he told the press that we are taking back our sacred space. And the president of the United Church of Christ said that it is time for our nation to have a sacred conversation about race. That is, that on Sunday, May 18th, 2008, the Sunday after Pentecost, which happens to be Trinity Sunday on the ecumenical calendar, the UCC is calling its 10,000 pastors to use their pulpits to address race. So where are we 40 years after the assassination of Dr. King? Now, the UCC is the only Christian denomination to fully embrace our LGBTQ community, and now it is calling this nation to address race. What do we gain or lose in the shift of commemorating King's assassination to celebrating his birthday? I believe that by celebrating his birthday, we participate in myth-making. We cover the phoniness that racism still exists. We continue to sing and sing "We Shall Overcome," a song that I have come to dislike just as much as I dislike the celebration of the 4th of July. By celebrating his birth, we perpetuate the serene Christmas-like atmosphere, like the celebration of Jesus, where we have the creche with Mary and Joseph and Jesus and the animals. We fail to realize that Mary must have been screaming in agony as she gave birth to this baby boy in a barn that was funky because there were animals. This is the myth that we have of Christmas. And so by celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., I believe that we collude in myth-making. By celebrating his birth, we avoid the tragic reality of his death. We don't want to deal with the cross, the Good Friday of the civil rights movement. We have to go back to Memphis. We have to go back to the Lorraine Hotel, just as we go back to Golgotha. We have to remember that the reason that Dr. King went to Memphis was to stand with black sanitation workers, and that there was a sanitation workers' strike on February the 10th, 1968, because two African-American men who were collecting trash during a torrential rainstorm were not allowed to go on the porches of white people, and so took refuge in the belly of the garbage truck. By freak accident, the garbage truck began to work, and they were minced like meat and killed in the garbage truck. To make things even more tragic, because they were unclassified workers, their families were not entitled to any benefits. So 40 years after King's death, if we celebrate his birthday instead of his assassination, we lose this truth and reality that there are still poor people, that there are still poor women and children who are left out of the picture in this country. We are not dealing with the fact that our black daughters and sisters are being sexualized on TV, and that it becomes so norm that we don't see anything wrong with it. And so by celebrating King's birthday instead of his death, we manufacture a myth. And we try to fuel an ideal of I have a dream. By celebrating his assassination, we debunk that myth. We have a kind of Good Friday. I'm not trying to elevate King to Jesus Christ, but he did die, I believe, on a cross, and that his death gives us the opportunity to talk about triumph in the midst of suffering, to talk about liberation even as we lament, to give platitudes to victory as we continue to celebrate Black and Womanist theology. And so I ask at this time, for such a time as this, where do we go from here?
I want to take a moment, and my sisters here have impressed upon me that we lost a panel member, and they would like to invite Professor Dr. Cornell West to join us, if you would please, to help us open up this question.
We knew Dr. West was going to take the floor on the mic on the floor. Good afternoon. It is good to be back at Yale Divinity. I was here many years ago co-teaching with Letty Russell, and it was a joy then. It's a joy to be back. It's interesting that Dr. Emily Towns asked us to talk without a manuscript, and that goes against all the former training I've had as a Black intellectual, because James Cone taught us, all of us who were trained at Union, you never get up without a manuscript, because usually we're the first people of African descent people have ever seen as a scholar. So we had to go, you had to be a Reggie Jackson, you had to knock it out of the ballpark every time, and then during the question and answers you get to be a human being. But you had to be able to, as Faith Rango, you had to fly. So I was preparing my lecture, and then my student who just defended her dissertation, Dr. Angela Sims, said, no, she had met Dr. Towns at a conference, and Dr. Towns said that we were going to have a conversation without a manuscript. I said, are you sure? I've never been to a scholarly conference and we can't read our papers. It's like, oh, what am I supposed to do? And then I realized, oh, I'm supposed to be what I teach, embodied, mediated knowledge. We're not to be talking heads. We're supposed to come from the floor. We're supposed to come from the gut. We're supposed to be vulnerable. I said, oh, that sounds like Emily. It's so much easier to read your paper and then wow everybody and speaking academies and then, like warm up and show some humor. So we have to start off as human beings. So when I got the question and realized I wasn't going to be able to write a paper and dazzle you with my brilliance, I was just going to have to be Katie Geneva Cannon in her rarest form. I decided, what did I want to say about the assassination? April 4th, 1968. April 4th, 1968, the Negro in me died and I became black. It was the day I decided to give my whole life to the work of justice. They said 125 riots happened in this country, and I was ready to be part of 126. We said we would kill every white person in Kannapolis and Concord if we have to, because they killed King. I was at Nova Scotia College and just finished my first year as a first-year student. I was so grateful that the juniors and seniors had been freedom riders, and they had been trained by James Lawson how to be nonviolent. So they locked us in the college chapel for a week. And we cried and we ranted and we cried and we ranted and we cried and we ranted. We were going to put ourselves in front of the Klan. We didn't care. We were going to burn the town down. How dare they kill King? And then as I started thinking about the Middle Passage as it related to assassination of King on April 4, 1968, the Middle Passage is that place between Africa and the Americas. And what makes the Middle Passage so powerful is the bottom rung of the triangle. And in order for it to be the Middle Passage, you got to have atrocities, violent atrocities, abductions to take people through this horror of this spoon-fed in the belly and the bowels of a ship to come across with sharks all around because they're throwing bodies overboard as they, get sick and die. So I tried to think about what was it the King symbolized that would make so many of us say, I would give my life because they killed him. Well, before King, it was like living in the belly of a slave ship. I'm from Kannapolis, North Carolina. We were the largest unincorporated town in the United States of America up until 1988. We were a modern-day plantation. Sociologists came from all over the world to study Kannapolis, the home of Cannon Mills. Mr. Charles Cannon owned the fire department, the police department, the land of the schools, the hospitals. He decided where the fire department would go and where it would not go. Every year in high school, we had to write letters saying why I appreciate Mr. Cannon. And I refused to write a letter. My best friend, Joyce Gibson's mother, was a janitor over at the White High School. So we knew where all the fallout shelters were because she would help her mother sometime clean the school. We went over to desegregate the school. And they told us they didn't have anything for us, so we went back over to the colored school. Our schools in North Carolina didn't desegregate until 1968 in my neck of the woods, even though the law was passed in 1954. So King, I'd never been to a public library until I went to college. Because of King, he opened that up. Had never been to a movie theater without up in the balcony until King opened it up. Never had to always go to the back door, go to the colored side of the bus station. All of what you read about Jim and Jane Crow was my reality. So when they killed King, it was like, we got to die. We got to do something. We cannot be nonviolent anymore. The day he spoke, and in 1963, in August, my great aunt, and we've been Presbyterians for 7 generations, so we're not shouting folk. She shouted that day. When he said, free at last, thank God Almighty for free at last, she shouted in our den and she said, your children are free. And we didn't know what it meant. She started crying. She said, you're free, you're free. So from 63, I really believed we were free. And it felt more like a jubilee than when the enslaved people were left. My grandfather was the only free child in his family. All of his ancestors were enslaved people in this country. So it was like, when King was assassinated, it was devastating. But I will always be grateful to those junior and senior women and men who have been in bus boycotts and sit-in and slit and everything, who knew how to be nonviolent, because they made us stay in that chapel until the anger subsided, so that we did not have to die in vain.
Wow. Wow, that's just so powerful. I'm just blessed to be up here with my dear sisters. This is it's a holy day in terms of the depth of love of Brother Martin that he had and his willingness to sacrifice his life. That I was in Memphis just yesterday on the balcony in front of room 306 with Sister Dorothy Cotton, who was in room 307 40 years ago. Harry Belafonte, Clarence Jones, his lawyer, and Brother Tavis Smiley. We were at Mason Temple as well, which is the world headquarters now, Church of God in Christ. You all know the great Charles Blake leading. Martin gave his last speech, mountaintop speech. And I said to myself, I mean, we have forgotten that Martin Luther King Jr. made a phone call to Ebenezer a few hours before he was murdered. And he said, I want to preach a sermon on Sunday before the march. It was called Why America May Go to Hell. And he was in some ways prophetic because, of course, after his vicious murder, there were over 125 rebellions. President Johnson had to deploy 125,000 troops, most troops ever deployed since the Civil War, actually to guard the White House on the one hand, but also control the cities. You know, for 9 months, the city of Wilmington, Delaware had cannons and troops in it. Cambridge, Maryland, we ain't even talking about Detroit, LA, Chicago, and so forth. It overflowed because Martin King had presented such a grand example and witness of commitment to love. But he understood justice is what love looks like in public. Just like deep democracy is what justice looks like in practice. And so his understanding of love meant he hated people being treated unjustly. He loathed people being treated unfairly. And so the kind of witness that he had constituted a particular model, a paradigm that people began to become highly suspicious of when he was murdered in the way that he did. That's why I resonate so deeply with my dear sister Katie Cannon. The rage, the righteous indignation, as it were. And so when I think of Brother Martin, I think that in so many ways, even given his great speeches and sermons, that his life was his greatest sermon. His life was fundamentally about unarmed truth and unconditional love. What does it really mean to be committed to unarmed truth? I understand the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, to allow the voices, to lift the voices of the wretched of the earth in that way. And I think in a certain sense to look then at Martin from the vantage point of his murder and death and assassination by repressive forces of both the state apparatus. The FBI does play a very important role here. If they didn't pull the trigger, they knew the trigger was being pulled. They did nothing to stop it. They surveyed Martin every minute of his life from July 63 till the day that he died. But for me, it means, what does it mean for us to look not just at Martin, not just at black history, but to look at world history through the lens of the cross? And it means to put a primacy on the catastrophic. Just like Jesus' crucifixion, Lorraine Motel, room 306 was catastrophic. It was horrendous. It was calamitous. It was scandalous. It was monstrous. That's the starting point from which you look at the world. And in that context, can you then generate a hypersensitivity to the suffering? Can you then love justice? Can you then be willing to serve with quality? Can you then be willing to sacrifice your life? Well, of course, he comes out of a people, a black people, who begin the modern world in catastrophic, calamitous, horrendous circumstances on slave ships, on plantations. And then the Jim Crow and the Jane Crow and the neo-slavery and the lynching and the terrorizing and the full-scale niggerization of trying to convince these black people they ought to be so scared, intimidated, deferential, feeling helpless and hopeless that they defer to white supremacist powers and think that's the norm. That's the way reality ought to be. And Brother Martin, along with others, because Ella Baker is right, the movement made Martin. He was a bourgeois preacher with his PhD, almost finished when he went down the gut bucket, Jim Crow, American terroristic South. It was a movement that made that Negro. But he was willing to grow And unlike most of our leaders, he loved us enough to tell us the truth and to die for us. That's a rare thing among a people who've been taught to hate themselves, to generate leaders who love them enough to be wounded by the people and still be a wounded healer rather than a wounded herder. To be scarred enough by Negroes and others and still be a scarred helper rather than a scarred play hater. That's the kind of Negro Martin was. Fannie Lou was too. Ella Baker was too. And when Martin heard about Echo Cole and Robert Walker, who was the name of those two brothers in February, who was minced almost like Sweeney Todd plus white supremacy. The body just ground it up, but it was white supremacist authorities behind it. We talked about that this morning, the white greed, the white hatred, the white fear that sits at the center of white supremacy. And then the critique of American imperialism. We don't have a better moral indictment of American imperialism than what Martin put forward exactly a year before he was shot down like a dog at Riverside Church. And to bring together a critique of the American empire on the one hand, already the critique of white supremacy, and then to connect it to black working class militancy, Local 1733 of Psce with Brother T.O. Jones, already a courageous organizer in Memphis. And Memphis is geographically in Tennessee, but we know it's psychologically in Mississippi. It's an extension of gut bucket, Jim Crow, terroristic Mississippi. Just the benefit of all that genius coming out of the Delta. That's where Martin decides to bear witness on his way, April 22nd, the mobilization for poor people across race, across gender, across culture, across state boundaries. And so for me, I want to end on this. You know, we used to sing when I was growing up at Shiloh Baptist Church, must Jesus bear the cross alone and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone. There's a cross for me. We have to decide, just like Sister Katie and all of us decided, how do we pick up our own crosses? How do we deal with our own wounds and scars and bruises and marks? Because when you pick that cross up, you're going to be wounded and scarred and bruised and marked. And in the end, you're going to die on your cross, just like Martin died on his cross. And the question is going to be, what's the quality of love and the depth of your service to others? Have you really attempted to stand up for justice and righteousness and truth? Have you really found joy in serving others as you are on your cross at the end? And that, in that sense, his life actually becomes a grand sermon, because he could have died so many other ways. But he dies right there with those I am a man seeking black brothers. That's his roots within the routes that's connected. Oppressed people all around the world. And still having unconditional love for the oppressor, even as he hates the oppression. This is what upsets me about the Jeremiah Wright thing. See, Martin Luther King Jr., he can declare unconditional love for Bull Connor and Jim Clark. He gets a standing ovation in mainstream America. But if he declares a love for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, a Minister Louis Farrakhan, or Jeremiah Wright, all of a sudden he's a xenophobe. And he's just trying to bear his cross. He's trying to be a Christian. And somewhere he read, as in the sermon on the plain, not necessarily on the mount, but on the plain, the 6th chapter of Luke. You're supposed to love your enemies. They ask you for the coat, give them the whole thing. Martin believed that. That's rare for Christians who really believe that. Rare believe that. And he was still flawed. We know he was flawed when it came to the gender question. Lord have mercy, that's another seminar. But we got to get it out there, because he's flawed. But any good sermon talks about your own flaws. You include it in your own sermon. Oh, self-righteous. You're part of the subject matter when you're preaching. Martin understood that. Sinner that I am, look at the witness that I bear. And in that regard, I could say to James Cone and all those folk who came after, including those distinguished members of this panel, build on that great legacy of Martin in our own distinctive ways, not imitating his voice, imitation suicide, but to create our voices by bouncing up against his voice. And in that sense, he smiles. You see, and we put a smile on that brother's face in the grave in ATL. We know that we're at least have not forgotten about a high standard of love and justice that he learned at the cross as a Christian preacher, as a Christian freedom fighter.
I want to thank the members of our panel, and I want to thank Dr. West for coming and joining us. I want to thank Professor Cleaver for making the move. Now's the time when we can converse with our panelists and to dig deep into what they have said and to bring our own perspectives to it. We have a front mic and a rear mic, so I encourage you to come up and talk with us. Dr. Paris.
Thank you very much, each of you, for these wonderful contributions. I don't want to take away from what Professor Cleaver or Professor Linda Thomas said in the way that they framed their comments. I want to say something in additional to each of them, their comments, and I hope that this is taken in the spirit in which it's given. Because I understand where you're coming from, both of you, in what you have said. It seems to me that the I Have a Dream speech is a great speech. Very few people have sat down and exegeted that speech sentence by sentence, which I take a great deal of pride in doing with my students and also with some church organizations. And when you do that, you discover that the way in which the press has taken the metaphor, I have a dream, and speak about it as if it's a vacuous, abstract document, they lose sight and do an injustice to that speech, which is filled with very radical stuff, beginning with a statement about the Founding Fathers, standing in the shadow of the great emancipator, and saying that we have come today to Washington to cash a check. And we have been told that there's insufficient funds, and that we don't believe that this treasury is empty. And if America does not do what it needs to be done, then America is not going to be able to sleep. And it was almost a kind of prediction of the long, hot summers and so forth. So anyway, I say that that's the substance of that speech is much more than the name, but the name gives the vision of what America should be and what African Americans have been striving with others to make it to be. The other thing I wanted to say is that Coretta Scott King and Congressman John Conyers spent 18 years trying to get a national holiday to commemorate Martin Luther King. And while, again, I think that the nation can do its myth-making around that and change the substance of the prophet and turn it into something else. The fact that we have a black man being memorialized by the nation every year for the rest of time, presumably, is something that we need to deal with, and to say, how should we put the right content into this day, and how even to help King's children who need to be mentored in this process, how to do that. I hope that this is contributing to what you were saying as well. Thank you.
I just would like to thank Dr. Paris for what you've said, and I suppose that I understand the content and the significance of the speech. I like to see meaningful ways to bring what speech is out to reality. It does feel static to me in some ways, and so my question would be, how do we build dream? Maybe we can ask that in a week about the dream King has, and add to that the powerful substance of his Vietnam speech and the speech against apartheid in South Africa and the Poor People's March. I think all of these are parts of King's life that we need to tag on, and even add the letter from Birmingham jail. So it's kind of looking at the life of King, similar to the fashion that Womanists like to talk about the life of Jesus, the life and ministry of Jesus, as we talk about the crucifixion.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Hi, my name is Joy Harris. I'm a MDiv student at Princeton Theological Seminary. I have a question, and that is, what do you think about the monument that is supposed to be going up for Martin Luther King Jr. at the Washington site? And do you see this as a way to further the dream, or is it a distraction for both the black community and the nation as a whole, as it relates to his memory and the question that we've attempted to answer today?
Don't leave yet, because I would like, after our panelists have had a chance to dialogue with you, for you to tell us how you feel about it.
I'm a little conflicted about it. I was actually in church, and we were asked to give something toward that. And I watched the presentation, but I wasn't quite sure exactly how I viewed that. I was a little, in one sense, I was, of course, yes, it's the only black man, the only black individual that is there on that monument, but the practical side of me said, well, what is this actually doing for us? Is it just another building where millions of dollars or billions of dollars are going to that could be going to other places and other things? Or is this another distraction for us to go and visit and say, yes, this is in honor of another person who gave his life, which is important. But as the conversation started before, earlier this morning, you know, there's so many other practical things that this could be used, the money could be used to address, you know, issues in our community. And so I was a little conflicted about how I actually felt about that.
How you feel about it, how you think about it, is as important as the question you asked about it. Thank you.
I'll begin to respond. I do know that when the black fraternities and sororities were having a little difficulty raising all the money for the monument, that the call did go out to the church, and I identified myself as a member of Trinity United Church of Christ, and I know that our church gave a substantial amount of money to fund the monument, along with many other churches. So that I think that it is extremely important, because in our culture, monuments carry history, and I think it is important for our future generations to know who King is, and for there to be something solid and in place for that history to be continued. So I think it's an important contribution rather than a distraction.
Well, I have a comment. I'm somewhat interested in public monuments. Just as a matter of statistics, there's more statues of horses in America than black men. There's more statues of horses than women. I was somewhat startled to read that the horses frequently have very important men on top of them. They're not just horses. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Andrew Jackson on horse.
I was startled to read that the first statue of an African in the United States was created in 1995, and that's here in New Haven, of Joseph Sank, of the Africans who were on the Amistad Tree. So in terms of the scale of public monuments and what is seen in the United States, there's a huge gap when it comes to anything that involves African American history. And so the fact that it is actually you might say, the cult that's developed around Martin Luther King that is the source of this is one thing. That's one issue. You know, I don't think anyone would say that we should go to the mall and take down the Lincoln Monument. No, we should add to. And I think that on some level there is a very awkward and hesitant process in this country of trying to find some way that's comfortable for white people to incorporate blacks into history in a public way. They're still wrestling with that. So I'm not wrestling with that, but there are a lot of other people who are wrestling with that, and I think maybe that the King statue is going to play a role there.
No, I support the memorial. I know my dear Alfred brother Harry's been working on this thing. You see, I understand that all monuments are ideologically and politically promiscuous. And what I mean by that, they'll lie with anybody's viewpoint. They're a mirror, and it depends on who looks in the mirror and what you project. Because Martin was a complicated brother, so you can be right-wing and say, well, Martin worked hard. That's the lesson. He worked hard. You just go on and work hard and be a right-wing person. Or he struggled against white supremacy. You can end up being liberal. Or he critiqued American imperialism, end up being more radical. Or he was trying to organize working-class people because the black bourgeoisie began to sell their souls for mess of pottage. When you begin to be anti or critical of the bourgeoisie, he was that complicated. So he's got so many elements inside of him. It depends on what you see and what you project in that monument. That's true for any monument. And I think it's very important that we have a monument for the occasion of those kinds of unsettlings and those kinds of wrestlings with soul and heart and mind. But recognizing that the dominant image of Martin Luther King will always be among a sleepwalking people, a highly deodorized, sanitized, sterilized Martin. That's what you get in a nation that suffers from spiritual malnutrition and moral constipation.
As Aretha Franklin would say, need I say more?
Others who want to join the conversation. This is a rough one to join up here, I tell you.
I'm Siobhan Garrigan. I am employed here at the Divinity School and the Institute of Sacred Music. And I have deeply appreciated the theological reflection that several of you pointed to or expanded upon about the significance of commemorating King's assassination because of the connection with the life, ministry, and especially the cross of Jesus Christ. And I would love, if you were willing, to hear more about where the resurrection fits in that scheme, in that analogy, because I worry that it is in a sense a hijacking of the very theology of resurrection that has led to this glib move to celebrate the birthday, and it seems that the resurrection quality of this story needs to be told, and told in a stronger way.
Anyone like to speak to that?
Do you all want to hit that?
I'll start on that.
Yeah. No, I'm going to follow my
Resurrection. For me, it's like, I go back to what I was just saying about the rage, is that when the rage gets channeled into constructive, long-term, life-term work, that is the dead becoming alive again. I used to believe that I would live, my lifetime commitment was to eradicate white supremacy in my lifetime. And then I started understanding white supremacy as a system, as institutions, and realized I would never live long enough, even I lived 10 lives, to eradicate it. But if I could teach, every course I teach, get one person to commit to be a lifetime doer of justice, then my living would not be in vain. I've been teaching for 33 years, and it has not failed yet. Every class I've ever taught, at least one person makes a lifetime commitment to the work of justice. That, to me, is resurrection. That I didn't have to die April 4th, 1968, and be mowed down by the Klan in Cabarrus County, but to take that energy, and that's why I will always be grateful to the SNCC people and those who were in the movements, who got spat on and dogs and gassed, and even they're doing more now about the Orangeburg massacre that happened in February 1968, where it was ignored because of Kent State, and they're doing a little more on Jackson State, the killings at Jackson State. But just thinking about how the resurrection for me is the dead living. How do you take that which, when I say the Negro died, but the black person was born, and out of that, like a phoenix coming up out of the ashes, and not just to have it for one person, but to, like I would tell my students, don't hide it, divide it. So it's like share it and make sure that none of our living is in vain. What is going to be our echo when we leave here? We're no longer on this side. What's our legacy? And it's to do the work of justice. But that's the way I respond to resurrection.
I think that it's very difficult to, it's like talk about reconciliation. People want reconciliation without justice. They want resurrection without crucifixion. So if you begin with the notion that, for the most part, we have formed of Christianity that are cross-free, cheap grace, easy victory, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do we ensure that the cross is injected in such a way that it's not sadomasochistic, but has to do with the suffering connected to commitment to love and justice? But it has to be humble enough, because Martin Luther King was always humble, because anybody involved in the freedom struggle knows you're never in control. So all these liberal, secular, modern construct of autonomy and self-mastery got to go. You ain't going to be in control of this thing. You're not the master of your soul, the master of society, the master of no time and space. You just a organism that's going to vanish in time and space, and you're trying to leave some mark by the witness that you bear. Boom. That's it. And then beyond that, the question becomes, how do we build on the legacy? Because it is true, there is no rebirth without death. Keep this in mind. That if Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, some august professor in a seminary, that his life would have less focus than if he died on that balcony, and the whole world from every corner of the globe must take note. So that he actually has an afterlife, given the death, that is more intense, that is deeper, has a scope and a breadth and a depth than if he had lived to be almost 80 years old and was Professor Emeritus and Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School. I ain't got nothing against Yale, you know, but could have been anywhere. But that's very important to keep in mind. It's very important to keep in mind. In that sense, he's being reborn each time Katie Candace in the classroom, Sister Linda's in the classroom, Sister Kathleen, Sister Joan. And it's not just black women, it's not just black folk, it's anybody who has the courage to pick up the cross, the love and justice.
Usually I come to these.
Excuse me. Linda wants to make a comment. Dr. Thomas wants to make a comment, sir. And then our sister behind you, and then you're next. How's that?
I wanted to say that a little bit of this question feels like, for me, kind of a gap between the understanding that Black Christianity has about talking about the cross and how I think white culture does not understand that resurrection happens every day as Black people get up and live their lives, kind of a defiance of continuing to live despite the cross that we bear every day. So that just as we talk about Good Friday, and Good Friday in the African American church is the 7 last words, and everybody is preaching for at least an hour. So this important ritual is so vital because we know that Sunday is coming and that there is victory. And there's something about the everyday life of Black folk that it is crucifixion, the cross, and rising from the dead literally every day. So resurrection is what matters and makes life happen as we continue to have triumph even as there is suffering on a daily basis. So that the resurrection is real, it is every day.
Our sister at the second microphone.
Bernice Cozy Pulley, who is 80 years old. But perhaps one of the important things that we can do in such august gatherings is to, again, amend the comments of the esteemed Kathleen Cleaver, that you can be reminded that there is in Washington, D.C., a monument to Mary McLeod Bethune. There are no horses, only children.
My name is Cedric Rodney. I was born in Guyana, used to be British Guyana. I feel pain today. On the 4th of April, 1968, we will always meet as Moravian ministers. I was the only Black person there. Wallace Elliott, around 5 minutes to 10, we began at 10 o'clock. He said, "Do you think they will kill Martin Luther King?" I said, "No, not at all." At 8 o'clock, I went to his house. He said, "They did it." I said, "What?" "King is dead." How you interpret that? I leave that to the panel. I feel pain. Thank you.
I think we all feel the pain, brother. But you know, I have a different take on that, brother. That I've always been amazed that Brother Martin lived as long as he did. Really, I am. If he had been in that house January the 30th, 1956, he would have been another dead Negro trying to tell the truth about America. You know what I mean? Or if he had sneezed and the black sister who stabbed him in 1957 in Harlem at Blumstein's store. And he got a cross over his heart, right? That is to say that Martin is living in a system of American terrorism in the south of the American empire. And he decided to be a truth teller and a witness bearer and to sacrifice and serve. And anybody who makes that decision then and now ought not to plan to live too long. See what I mean? So the fact that he made it to 39, it's like, good God. You see the point I make? You want to say something right back to brother?
Footnote to that.
Sure, sure.
It was a Guyanese surgeon who saved his life in Harlem Hospital. Footnote.
Oh, Lord, no, nationalistic, a little bit tribalistic. We talk about the cross. But no, when you mention the flag, and then we talk about the cross. But I'm with you, my brother, and I thank God that guy needs brothers saved, and he's the one who left that cross right over his heart. Oh, yes, back to the cross again.
Good afternoon. Thank you once again for all your participation in this panel. My name's Dan Binder. I'm currently a student here at the Divinity School. Now, Dr. Cannon, you were speaking earlier about participation in national myth-making, and I might have misinterpreted that, but it sounded very negative the way you meant it. Now, I'm 25 years old. When I was born, Ronald Reagan was almost in his second term. So in some sense, all I have access to are these myths. The reality, at best, for me, is third or fourth hand. I can hear old people tell stories, but that's not the same as being there, and I don't think it ever can be. Just in my own life, I remember in second grade, we learned about Columbus in September for Columbus Day. We learned about the Pilgrims for Thanksgiving. And then in January and February, we learned a little bit about Dr. King. So my question to you is, if you all could have the opportunity to shape a kind of second grade curriculum for very young people, young Americans coming up, what myth would we make about Dr. King? What stories would we tell? And in some sense, is that more important or less important than the actual reality of the man as he lived and died?
Okay, thank you. I think one of the myths that we have to debunk is that all black people don't look alike. I didn't talk about myth. That was Dr. Thomas. I've been called Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilks. I've been called Dr. Sean Copeland. I've been called Dr. Emily Towns. I've been called Dr. Dolores Williams. I've been called Dr. Jackie Grant. And then one day I stopped when they called me Dr. Rebecca Chop. I said, I'm not Rebecca Chop. Dr. Thomas, who talked about that, will not answer your question.
No.
I would like to respond to your question. I was at a conference some years ago at Trinity College in Hartford, and it was a conference about the Southwest Georgia movement for SNCC. And so there were different SNCC activists who had been working on the voter registration, and this is significant because it was called by a professor who was on the faculty there in history, and this is before SNCC had asked the white people to go and work in the white community. And so it was a mixed group. Lots of old SNCC people came there, and one of the students got up to one of the panels, for example, had Stokely Carmichael, Cleveland Sellers, and 5 or 6 other people on it. So one of the students listening to the panel, she got up and said that she was very impressed to see all these people who were civil rights workers, because she was under the impression that the civil rights movement was Dr. King. And now she had seen, like 8 other people that were part of the civil rights movement. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. And I said, oh my goodness, these people think King did everything. So in terms of the myth, the one I would like to see is something that Martin Luther King himself acknowledged, and that is in Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott. It's the movement that made Martin Luther King the leader, not Martin Luther King the leader who made the movement. So if you want a myth, I think that's a more helpful myth. And I think there's this notion of collective mass action organized from the bottom up, grassroots, largely by women. That is the story of civil rights. That's the myth I would like you to see, and that's the constellation in which King should be put.
I appreciate the question, particularly because we have a 7-year-old, and we've had to work with teaching first and second graders about African American history and that kind of thing. But I do want to say that there was a teacher named Jane Elliott who lived in Iowa who decided to make a lesson for her 3rd grade class. Why? Because Martin Luther King had been the hero of the month, and then he was killed. And she wanted to teach 3rd graders about why that happened. And she did an experiment on racism. The video that you can see that records this is called A Class Divided. I continue to show that movie in many of the classes I do on identity and difference. I don't think it's too early to begin to teach second graders about race and difference in a way that they can understand it, and the importance of things like the Underground Railroad. My first grade daughter's class did a unit on the Underground Railroad. They actually made the railroad along with the quilts that had the symbols and all of that, so that there are many things that can be done to teach children the reality of institutional racism around identity and difference that I think lead the way to King and what he represented and why he's important for everybody to know and celebrate.
Can I just say a quick word about that, though? Because, I appreciate that question, though, brother. But first, I think we have to draw a distinction between myths and lies. That's very important. Because myths, they say, are never true but true all the time, under all conditions. That's fairy tales. Lies are stories that are told in order to hide and conceal somebody else catching hell. Do you know what I mean? And I'll give you a good example of this. Look at the response of the mainstream press to the death of William Buckley. Now, William Buckley was very kind to me. We and I had wonderful dialogues. He was a right-wing white brother. But not a mumbling word about the fact that he diligently supported apartheid in America and apartheid in South Africa. Now, why is that important in terms of that silence? Because it means that the mendacious narratives that still circulate in the minds of most Americans across the board, but especially white brothers and sisters, are stories in which black people do not count and black suffering does not matter. And this is certainly true for indigenous peoples. You see, so an American myth that they found in virgin land, that's not a myth, that's a lie. It's a mendacious story so that you don't have to come to terms with the fact that red brothers and sisters count, that their suffering has gravitas like anybody else's suffering. And the same is true with Ronald Reagan. You don't have to mention the fact that he supported Jim Crow and Jane Crow, was against the Civil Rights Bill, Voting Rights Bill, open housing, because like we saw in Katrina, it's clear that things are normalized to such a degree black suffering doesn't matter, which is really the meaning of race matters. Black suffering matters in the stories that you tell. Doesn't mean everybody else's suffering is downplayed, but it matters. Well, see, how do we get at these lies? And of course, you being at Yale, you're being exposed to puncturing these lies. Is that right? So somebody's educating you. There ain't no doubt about that. Now, myths are a little bit different, but I mean, that's a whole different thing. But the line is what is ugly, because the lies actually have motivations behind them. If this black suffering is highlighted, they may wake up and constitute a threat to our power and our privilege and our benefits. Hey, then that's when Martin and Christian love comes in. That's when justice comes in. Folk waking up, straighten their backs up. Well, that's a rare thing, because powers that be doing all they can to keep them sleepwalking, especially in the churches.
I wanted to make a comment to my young colleague behind me. One really excellent source for second graders is the collection of books and stories by Faith Ringgold, who is a subversive truth teller. And she writes the stories of black history in these children's books, and I would suggest that you buy an entire set because she speaks plain English. This year, I was a senior in high school when Dr. King died. I remember the day, the moment, the hour. I went to a white high school on the south side of Chicago. All the black kids gathered in the cafeteria and sat. And we all decided that that was the day, not that we became black, but that we became adults. And it's a very powerful moment to me. So this year at the college where I'm working, I tried to get the students to commemorate Dr. King's death. They did not want to do it. They wanted to do the birthday. They want to do performance. They want to do hip-hop, rap, dancing, singing, performance. I get it. But they do not understand that the movement was young adults. I remember certain people up on the panel that were in the front of the movement when I was a young adult, looking to those people as my peer mentors. And they do not understand that the other part of the movement was this vast array of complex working black women. So I just wonder if you could each talk a little bit about the importance of how we can do this in the context of curriculum that is truth-telling, not just, I'm sorry, Cornell, the church is not any worse than if my mother wasn't here, I would say the word blankety textbooks, because these textbooks are a horror. There is no mention of the names of the people who did the work of the movement. So could you just talk a little bit about maybe what you do or how we can lift this up so that the generations behind the baby boomers can get some motivation to understand and read about the truth?
Cornell hasn't said it in today's presentation, but I've heard him and others talk about, because he does hip-hop and rap, and I'm Motown, so it's like, and so he can relate to a generation that I'm still like dazzled, even my nieces and nephews, and some of you know Wild 'N Out, Nick Cannon. I cannot relate to my own nephew. I mean, it's like, what is he doing? We call each other on the phone and go like, what is he? Yeah, okay. So I say that to say that we've got to learn, as a 58-year-old woman, have to keep working on how to be intergenerational. And it is intentional work, because I don't want to lose the ability to cross generations. And I remember the day I was teaching at Temple University, a course on racial justice, and I always start the class off with conscientization, and the student said, Tupac died today. And I said, okay, we got that. What else is going on? And they said, Tupac died today. And I said, okay, we noted that. Are there anything else happening in the community we need to take note of? And they said, Doc, Tupac died today. I said, we have that what else? And they said, it is like when, you know what it was like when Elvis Presley died? I said, no. I said, because he said all we could do is shine his shoes and buy his records. So I was not an Elvis Presley fan. They said, but do you know what it was like when King died? I said, you got my attention. We spent the next hour and 15 minutes talking about the significance of Tupac's death to these 18 and 19-year-olds. So it's like one of the things that has to happen in curricula is what matters to that generation, as opposed to transposing my generation onto, and then getting that intergenerational conversation going. But it's intentional work, and it has to be done so that we hear each other into speech, as Neal Morton would say. And oftentimes, we tell our stories, but we don't hear their stories. And so when they knew they could, if they said it enough, I would finally understand why I needed to understand Tupac. And now when my nieces and nephews talk about Tupac is resurrected, and I still am lost. That's a movie. That's a movie. Oh. They say he's really not dead. I mean, I'm lost.
I just like to respond to something that is one of the failures of the civil rights era, civil rights movement, in the sense that the people who put their lives on the line and went out to radically transform the society and, suffered and died in voting rights campaigns and did so many things that brought about legal changes, ideological changes, personal changes. They did these things, but what they did not do, except in very, very, very minuscule ways, is to go into the elementary schools and change what the next generation was taught. So the very same ridiculous things that we were taught, I mean, I think kids probably still read See, Spot, Run, Dick and Jane. I mean, the school system retained the same education and the same, that struck me during the era in the 80s of the church burnings. And I said, but wait a minute. Didn't we do, these are not the same people who were bombing churches in Mississippi. This is the next generation down. But they're using the same methods and taking out the same insanity in the same, so there's a, a reproduction of white supremacists, a reproduction of black submission. I mean, I have to, I was sort of flabbergasted at an email I got a few days ago from a professor at University of Tennessee at Martin. I had been there for something, every year they have a civil rights conference. And the email said, well, can you talk to me about who we might bring to speak next year, because I've surveyed most of the black students, and they all seem to believe, along with Bill Cosby, that the failings that black people see are basically their fault. And I said, oh my God, you know, so the whole idea of systemic racism, institutional racism, exploitation, this whole history, it's evaporated. They believe what the colorblind mentality says is true. So we have a very broad problem. In terms of the way we are able to transform the understanding of history. And it's not just first grade. I mean, we have to do a lot of work, and that's a failing, I think, of the movement. But part of the reason is that these movements were sabotaged, they were destroyed, people were persecuted, they were exhausted, and at one point when I realized that almost no one really had any clue exactly, they sort of had a clue about those black power people with afros, but they didn't quite know who was who. I was, never forget, I had to come back to school in the 80s as an adult, and I was walking down the street in, what's the street, right, I think it's Wall Street, right beside Sterling, and somebody walked past me, but then after we passed, she said, I'm so glad to see you here, Mrs. Carmichael. And I felt like I would never have married him. No, no. You know, all black men look alike. No, but what I meant is they're going to mix us all up. We're all kind of the same person, and they kind of know about us. So, you know, it's like, if, like the young man said, that he wasn't there, he doesn't know. How do we get that? Because the changes were fleeting, because the power structure was able to restore and undo so much of that. It's like, almost like it didn't really happen. So we have a bigger problem than just curriculum, I think. Anyway.
Before Dr. Thomas answers, we've got 3 people in line, and we'll take those questions after Dr. Thomas responds, and then we'll be about at the end of our time.
Let me just say, now you know how I feel when they refer to me as Cornell's wife.
Jesus, wonderful. Jesus, wonderful.
Dr. Thomas.
Well, Claudia, I hear your question being one about how do we bring to the foreground the importance of black women, particularly in the civil rights movement and beyond, and how do we teach that to children? I think that we really have to begin by acknowledging that there is a black patriarchy, and that as we deal with issues of civil rights, we really don't want to talk about that, because that could be very easily handled by black men normalizing in their discourse what black women have always done, are doing, how they got where they are, and all of that. So that is a shout out to every black man here today to help a sister along. The other thing that I think we have to do as black women is to move beyond internalized sexism and begin to normalize the discourse. It is just recently that we began to talk beyond what Stokely Carmichael said about the place of black women in the movement being prone. We've just moved beyond that by Belinda Robnett talking about the very clear issues of sexism in the black power movement. But I don't know what kind of press that is getting, but I've used that book in my courses, and I think we need to normalize books like Rosetta Ross's Witnessing and Testifying. If there's somebody who can move that into books that little people read, and big people get to read them to little people, I think that we would begin to move forward. So I think that it's a intentionality to, first of all, take children seriously. I think that black theology and womanist theology really needs to put children, black children, as the norm, as Marian Wright Edelman has done, and to continue to push that forward.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. It's you.
Yes. All right. My name is Elaine Lettrek, and I'm a doctoral student at the Union Institute in Cincinnati, Ohio. I entered the Institute in 1994, the time I was living in Birmingham, Alabama, and teaching at the University of Montevallo. History, that's my field. Well, for a dissertation, I decided to interview white Southern ministers who worked with Martin Luther King for black civil rights. I've been working on it for 14 years. It's just about finished. But what I wanted to share with you today was some of the stories that they told me about Martin Luther King, because that was the subject of this table, right? And one in particular.
Do you have one really nice short one?
I have what?
One really nice short one?
Yes.
Short story.
Yes, it's very short.
Thank you very
short. Floyd Enfinger, a Methodist minister, worked with Martin Luther King in Montgomery in 1957 in an interracial meeting planning for the boycott. And that was the big event in his life, he said, because Martin Luther King told him that if you want to accomplish something great in life, don't worry about who gets the credit. That's the story.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that cuts against almost every value of the bourgeoisie and every capitalist society in the modern world. Don't worry about the credit. Don't put yourself forward. Get your ego in check. Focus on something bigger than you. Eye on the prize, not on your individual project. That's a rare thing. That's a beautiful story.
Thank you.
My name is Ko Ping Lin, and originally from Taiwan, and I'm a Divinity School student. And I want to ask, when I experienced this conference, I really learned a lot about Martin Luther King. And as a Chinese, I saw the Dalai Lama, what happened, the situation he's suffering, and what question he met. I feel it's the same as Martin Luther King. So you bring up different scenario together. So I want to know about how did you see what Dalai Lama, what he did for the Tibet, and what Chinese used the weapon to shooting all the monk in the Tibet. I want to know, did you see the Martin Luther King sword in applied in the Dalai Lama's, what he had done, about his statement in the piece? Thank you.
Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can capture this. Our brother asked the panel to think about addressing how can we understand the work of the Dalai Lama in relationship to the work that Dr. King did and the kind of struggles that the Dalai Lama is facing. Is that in Tibet? In the Tibetan struggle.
Well, they both were fundamentally committed to nonviolence and peace. They both live every day under threat of death. One is defending a particular nation under imperial subjugation, China vis-a-vis Tibet. Martin was not so much a nationalist in terms of a black nationalist. He's a patriot vis-a-vis the American empire. but he was defending a people, so we never confuse nationhood with peoplehood. But he was defending a people. But like Desmond Tutu, they were fundamentally committed to nonviolence. I think that has a nobility. I think the Dalai Lama was a pacifist too, though, isn't he? Yes. And Martin was a pacifist. You see, I'm a Christian. I'm not a pacifist. I believe in just war. I believe in just war. Oh, then somebody show up at my house. It's me and the Holy Ghost and something else.
And something else.
If anyone else want to respond. Okay. All right.
We have one more.
Thank you.
We have one more.
We have one more question.
Hello, my name is C. Artis Gardner. I'm an undergraduate student here at Yale, and I'm also the mother of 3 children. So I just wanted to share something really quickly. About a week ago, my son and I were talking, and somehow it came up. We live a couple towns north of here, which is it's a white town. Maybe 4 black families. I don't know, maybe a little more. But so we're talking, and my son says, "Well, Mom, last week at school, Aiden told me I couldn't play with his toys because I would get black germs on it." I said, "Okay." I said, "How did you feel about that?" He said, "Well, I thought he was my friend, but now I'm not sure, but I'm okay. You know, I mean, it was last week. I forgotten it happened." And this was before bedtime. So then in the morning, I've been thinking about it, so we're going to talk about it some more. So I said, so what do you think of that? Because his mother is one of the kindergarten teachers, you know, and do you think that she teaches him that at home? And he said, "Mom, she's not only a teacher, she's a mom. I don't think she's teaching him that. I don't know." And I said, "Jackson, a lot of things are going to happen when, especially, you know, being a black male, we're in an all-white town, you go to a white school, and when you go to college, you'll probably be one of, you know, only a few blacks, and when you go to work, you know, you have to get used to this." I said, "If more things like this happened, you know, and it really started to hurt your feelings, would you ever wish to be different? Would you ever wish to have white skin?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why?" Because it surprised me. He's 6. He said, "Because I like being black. It's who I am." And I said, and you're beautiful. And I thought, you know, I'm a truth teller with my children. We talk about race all the time. I think you have to. And it starts at home. I don't send, you know, I send my kids to school for education, but it's not up to the schools to teach my children who they are. They're going to get that at home. And I thought, he's 6, and he knows who he is. I don't have to worry about him. And it just, you know, I mean, I think you just have to tell the truth. And thinking about Martin Luther King Day for my children, it's never been a day off. It's always a day on. And they could do projects individual or together, but they always have to pick a person outside of Martin Luther King, outside of Rosa Parks. They have to pick an obscure person that did something in the civil rights movement. So again, it's just the truth-telling, and it starts at home.
I would recommend Ella Baker for some serious. Well, she's not obscure now. Yeah, that is true. But maybe to young people might still be obscure, though. That's true.
I would like again to thank Dr. Emily Towns for a really interesting question. And I'd also like for us to thank Dr. West, Professor Cleaver, Professor Thomas, and Professor Cannon. Thank Dr.